if you're a fan of a certain metagame in particular, like let's say Advanced OU is your thing in the competitive Pokemon sphere, then when the Smogon Premier League, Smogon's biggest team tournament, and arguably biggest tournament overall, when that comes around, you are going to be following the advanced games, for example, way more than the others. That's going to be your investment in the tournament. So in 2017, the SPL Finals was initially disappointing to advanced fans because this was the game between Ojama and Jabba the Griffin. And without going into a whole backstory, I don't think Jabba was really in an advanced headspace at the time, or even a Pokemon headspace, because he was very vocal in how he disliked the tier, and so when the time came to play Ojama in the finals, you might say that looks like an unusual team with the Umbreon doing the whole trap pass thing, and it is an unusual team. It basically uh, tries for an unsuspecting matchup win. And this is something that happens in tournaments sometimes that players will just go, "Oh, I'll never beat the other guy. I'm just gonna, fish for a good matchup and hope it goes my way," which I feel pretty strongly about disliking. But that's a whole different video altogether. Anyway, so watching a game like this, you could feel like this is supposed to be the finals of the biggest tournament around. Like, really, that's what we get, and sometimes that happens. Of course, sometimes it happens that games wind up being not so hyped for other reasons. Like there's a crit, there's two crits in the first 5 turns, and it goes downhill from there. But generally, that's not something you can really blame the players for. Whereas in this, it was like it's easy to watch games like this and feel snubbed, like especially if you're trying to get in an SPL and see. And I'm not trying to take shots at Jabba, by the way. First of all, this is years old. Second of all, this is not the only instance of people sitting on the sidelines and watching. It's like, oh, I could beat that guy. This is what the biggest stage is supposed to be. That happens a lot, even in games that are going perfectly fine. People will say silly things like, "Oh yeah, that guy who played pretty much perfectly in that game. Well, he made a slight error on turn 16. I would wipe the floor with him." So this game was disappointing, and we're gonna skip through the rest of it because it's just a pretty simple Ojama win. Incidentally, the year before this, Jabba really tore up the advanced field. So anyway, advanced fans were then rewarded for their well, not really rewarded for doing anything, but they were given something way more hype to make up for this disappointing finals game. In that, as soon as Ojama wins with Flygon here, yeah. So instead, the series went to a tiebreaker, and so we got McMegan versus Ojama in Advance OU. Two of the best to ever do it in a metagame that is among their most defining as a player, if not the most. So this was incredibly exciting. But it didn't live up to the hype as this happens a lot that games between two great players wind up not being as good as promised, but it's generally, like I said earlier, it's for Pokemon reasons. There's an early freeze, stuff like that ruins it. So stuff that could have gone in the history books as a great game is ruined for Pokemon being silly. But the Jabba game was whereas that one was just let me shoot for an auto win with Umbreon Pass, which that's a tough sell in any tournament, let alone the finals of SPL. But the thing about Jabba there is that he was not too happy with the state of advance at the time, but he wasn't alone. And that's why this battle becomes interesting. It's between two players who decided that Spikes was too prohibitive on the advanced metagame. And so they decided in the Smogon Premier League Finals tiebreak to play their battle with Spikes banned. Not no Skarmory. I mean that would be bad too. No Skarmory, no Fortress, no Cloister. I mean you can bring Skarmory if you want. You're just not supposed to bring Spikes on it. So this was immensely controversial, especially because there's a lot of players saying And this is where I'm sure the comment section will come in. It's like, oh, I'm glad they play without spikes because I hate Skarmory and I think people who use it should burn in hell or something like that. And then there are other people who will say, yeah, no, that's it's a disgrace to the game and it's all that other stuff. Which I'm pretty sure even these guys at this point, I know McMegan at least has said it's like, yeah, I kind of can't believe we did that. That was pretty silly. But I wanted to make this video because it's part of an ongoing thing about how powerful Skarm and its spikes are. And because people right now are in this phase, and I'm going to make a video about it, about how they consider Skarm better than T-Tar. And it's not just about spikes, obviously, but it is such a major part of it. And I wanted to make this video to look back. It's like people were so frustrated with the impact of spikes in Advance that you had this game, an SPL Finals tiebreak where they agreed to play without it, which is mind-blowing. I mean, and there was a war in that thread after. Oof. Triangles was vocally against it, and then Ojama started screaming at him about how terrible he was, and which was ironic because Triangles had beaten Ojama earlier in that season in SPL, but he had used a boring spikes team by Ojama's admission, and Ojama was like, yeah, go watch that game if you want to see spikes. It was very interesting, and it came down to a whole, it's boring when spikes are in play kind of thing. And that kind of thing is subjective in a competitive environment, so it was, yeah, we're sick of spikes. And, then you have letter of the law people saying, well, they didn't break any rules. But it was also a gentleman's agreement kind of thing. So if one of these guys brought spikes, then there was nothing the other player could do about it. It's not like you could say, hey, you broke the gentleman's agreement. Yeah, but they're not breaking any rules. It's not something that would be enforced by the hosts of the tournament. There would be people who would say, oh, that's dirty. And then other people would be like, no, if your opponent is stupid enough to agree to that, then yeah, of course. And in fact, I kind of wish that had been what happened. that would have been juicy. Instead, we have what wound up being a disappointing finals tiebreak because we got a game that has nearly no relation to Advance OU at all. Insofar as both teams are built with the assumption that they will not face spikes, which pretty much means they can ignore so much of what shapes advanced team building. And it's a fun little thought experiment. You can have a little side tournament, but and I remember both guys after like, oh yeah, I had a lot more fun in this spikeless environment. It's like, yeah, one game. I'm sure they tested without it, but you can never do stuff like this. It's the same logic why whenever people talk about testing, let's say Mew in Gen 3 or 4 OU, it's like you're not going to get an accurate picture of that from a couple games or even like a couple weeks of a suspect test ladder. The only way to really test this kind of stuff is through an extended tournament situation where the stakes are for real, and that is how you guarantee player investment and real metagame development. It's how Latias was retested in DPPOU, for example, but that had precedent of Latias existing beforehand in the tier, and of course the metagame strongly adapting to it. But anything else is not feasible. So if you really wanted to test a spikesless advanced metagame, then I think you would have to, do it in a more extended format than just one game. But I understand the sentiment, even though I disagree, and I think I even said in the thread because it really rubbed me the wrong way. If you want to look it up, just go to smogan.com/forums, and I know that already turns people off because people hate forums and don't like reading. But if you want to see where we used to carry out our arguments, then go to the Smogan forums, go to the tournament section, go to the Smogan Premier League section, and go to the Smogan Premier League finals thread from 2017. Yeah, and forum drama used to be it. Let me tell you. But yeah, and I basically what I said was that advance. If you think that spikes are the oppressing factor, I said no. Sand is what really shapes the metagame. So if you want to have greater selection in your available pool of Pokemon or whatever, then you got to get rid of sand. That's what's holding back your Snorlaxes or whatever else you think are getting, your Suicunes, things that are getting ruined by spikes. But it is an interesting thing to think about, that because people complain about hazards all the time. That this is not an advanced OU specific thing, but I was particularly thinking about it in the wake of this whole Skarm is the best Pokemon in the tier thing, um, and how players are running 6 Pokemon immune to spikes, which has never been seen before, just because that's how much they don't want to deal with them. Now you can say that's not necessarily spikes being broken. That's just the player base not wanting to deal with them, only wanting to deal with them a certain way. And I would even agree with you. But yeah, I think this battle is also a good example of why whenever someone goes into an old tier and goes, how is this allowed? This thing is the most broken thing I've ever seen in any metagame ever, and this tier is literally unplayable garbage, and we need to remove it immediately. And, yeah, I wouldn't use one game as proving anything, especially in such a literally, precedentless tier like Spikesless Advance. But I don't know what the goal was, to feel less pressured, so instead we have these immense stall wars only broken up by explosion. And people used to rip on GSC for this. And this is what the Spikesless game turned into. So I'm interested in the comments, though. I'm thinking, what do you think? Do you hate spikes? Do you hate entry hazards? Do you think, because if anything, Advanced generally gets well regarded for entry hazards being quite balanced in it, because you don't have flying Pokemon and levitating Pokemon affected by them, and so it's like, oh, it's reasonable to play around them. And even in that scenario, as here we see a Cursed Swampert, which is a good Pokemon, I'm just being a little silly. It's more that in the team it's supported by. It's literally just, let's make the most walled by Skarm team ever. It's why people were saying, hey, they should bring Skarm and just not click spikes with it, because it's going to wall whatever's on the opposing team, and they're kind of right. We see 2 Cursed Swamperts. Oh, and a counter Blissey. Cool. Well, yeah, whenever there's... I don't know. I'm also a little upset because this could have been such a legendary Pokemon's Greatest Battles thing, and instead it turned into this whole... Oh, crucial Rock Slide missed there, getting the extra DD. This whole... I don't know, it's... Oh, that's the point I was making, that even in this environment where spikes are theoretically at their weakest, then you have to... then they're still necessary, or not necessary, but optimal. If you want to make a winning team, then you're gonna want to abuse spikes the best, just because letting the hazards do the heavy lifting for you makes for incredibly consistent teams. And consider GSC. I mean, in fairness, GSC only has a couple non-affected Pokemon, because it's only flying types, because there's no abilities. But even with the one max layer, so much of GSC offense is about spikes. And spikes is pretty much, more or less required on a good GSC team. I think it is anyway. And I know a lot of other top players agree with that. Whereas in Advance, you see a lot of people say, this is what really sells it for me. In Advance, people say, oh no, Skarm's not even that good. Skarm's not broken, da-da-da. And then when the chips are down and when it's a real tournament scenario that matters, then all that talk about, oh, Advance, you can use anything, you can get creative, and that goes flying out the window, and you see the same people who complain about how boring everyone is with their Skarm, Gar, T-Tar, Bliss, Swampert nonsense is. You see them bringing those same exact teams. It never fails. So I'm not even necessarily the Skarm Bliss part, but Skarm plus proven stuff, because every time, and I have tried to do this too. I never had a problem with bringing Skarm stuff. I never criticized people for using it because oh, it's boring. It's well, it's competitive. You find the best strategy and you use it. But this is about whether it or not it is the best strategy, even when it's at its most balanced theoretically. And then you always try to find different styles to use just because it's natural to branch out. And then you wind up coming back to Spikes and Friends, even if not necessarily Skarm, but Spikes, just because you see just how powerful hazards are in enabling all sorts of offense. Like, yeah, so this game was not necessarily about the game itself, although it is a significant historical event in terms of these two legendary players basically giving the finger to the rule set. I mean, not necessarily, they didn't break any rules, but just saying, yeah, we will play without spikes. It'd be like if I was playing someone in, I guess it's not the same as if they said, let's play DPPOU instead. I mean, they could have done that and then just like had a cursory advance game planned out for whoever the winner, whoever the winner was, theoretically. But at least this was like the actual game. But it'd be like if I was playing someone in Gen 5 OU or Gen 4 OU, and I was like, hey, do you want to just play UU instead? And then we did. And technically, you can play a UU game in the OU rule set. That's not going to be blocked by Showdown. Just yeah, so killed the spirit of the game. But it also opens up another conversation about spikes and whether they're healthy, and it goes back to that entry hazards broken video I made, because the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, I don't love what they do to the game, but I don't know if completely getting rid of them is the play either. And where do you fall on the scale of this is so good, you got to use it if you want to be optimal, and everything else is just, coping with the fact that you're using something less optimal just so you're less predictable, which is not a pleasant dichotomy to be presented with in a tournament setting, let me tell you. It's like, oh, well, I want to use this because it's good, but it's expected of me, and that, it's a very nuanced issue, of course. But it's nasty stuff to be caught in. So, yeah, that's a lot of material for thought I'm going to leave you with. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to what you thought. And either way, I will see you again tomorrow.